this is a maze runner in a 3D template.
This is a cube runner.
Oh, cube runner.
So the idea, okay, you know what? I can just pull up a picture. That's easier. I was gonna draw it, but then I was like, that's not necessary. I could actually just find one and play it. Framegames.weebly. This is probably a cube runner. I'll play it real quick. Let me turn my volume down. Run Adobe Flash. Yeah. Just delete my files. Destroy my computer. Alright, let's see. Thank God there's no weird ads nowadays. On this site at least. Okay, so yeah, this is a cube runner where there's a bunch of cubes that you have to try and dodge, and you pilot something that you can go left and right. And wow, this frame rate is amazing. So we're going to be making something very similar to this. Sad. Absolutely sad. Yeah, that's not bad. I don't actually know if that's good.
I think that was pretty bad.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's pretty bad. So we're going to be doing some tricks to make this easier on ourselves, because fun fact, a lot of cube runners don't actually move forward. You actually just sit in place and your obstacles come towards you, and it looks like you're going forwards. So yeah, so really just the cubes come towards you and it gives the illusion of moving. And the reason you do that is because a lot of different reasons. For instance, Unity uses floats to calculate position and most of its values. Do you guys know what floats are at all as values?
Floating point numbers.
Yeah, it's basically like a decimal, but it is most accurate around 0, and it gets less accurate the further away from 0 you get. So if you actually moved far enough away from the origin, your position and stuff would look really janky because it's jumping around instead of being smooth. So it's actually better for you to stay close to the origin and for the objects to come towards you. And it makes things a little bit easier as well, just with loading and whatnot. So, but it'll look like you're going forward. I'm almost positive that the game I just played was you sitting still and the cubes coming towards you. So I would assume that that's the case. But so I think we got probably most of the people we have here. So after you've made a new Unity project, head into Assets and Import Package like we did last week, and Custom Package, and then find wherever you downloaded it. I just realized I didn't actually download it. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm very on top of things today. So let's save that. No. Import package, and it's called coding in unity.unity package. So this is what you should see when you're importing it. So here we are importing a scene. So there's these little graphics on the right here on the package little screen that pops up. So new means this is a brand new asset, so it won't mess with anything. The circular arrows, if you highlight over it, says this file is new or has changed. So there's already a sample scene in our project, and I am importing a new sample scene. So if you import this, it will actually overwrite the old sample scene, which you don't want to do sometimes. So if you see that when you're importing a new package, make sure it's something you don't mind losing or disappearing, because if you accidentally get rid of hours of work because you named something the same as somebody else, you might really not be happy with it. So go ahead and hit import. Once you got that, everything should be checked. Make sure you grab it all. And then you can hit reload when it pops up with this, because it's saying that the scene has now been changed, like I said. And when you reload it, you should see this. Has anybody loaded it and not seen the red triangle thing? Yes. The player prefab isn't working? What version of Unity are you using? Are you using a new one? When did you update? Yeah, so we had that issue last week where older versions of Unity wouldn't load the player prefab correctly. So, yeah, I'm not sure what the best way to do it is, but you'd probably have to recreate it. You don't have to use a triangle. You can use like a cube or a sphere or something. But yeah, is anybody else having problems loading in the prefab? Everybody else is working fine? Okay. So if you've tried running this, which feel free to, you'll see that you'll notice that our player's there and absolutely nothing happens no matter what you press. That's because our player, essentially, if you look at its components, which we learned about last week, on the right, you can see it's got its transform, it's got its model, it's got its mesh renderer, so this is what actually renders the basically skin of it, which you can see if you disable, that disappears. We've got our collider, which basically is just the physics collider on it. That it will. That's how it calculates if it's actually touching something. And then we've got the rigid body on it, and the rigid body is there only because it needs to be for what we're doing. So don't worry too much about that. But that basically just allows physics to work on this. But in the rigid body is this nice little option, which you'll learn about more next week, which is called isKinematic, which basically means don't move. So it's a physics object, but kind of not really. So right now it does absolutely nothing, which we want to fix. We should fix that. So let me pull up my notes really quick so I don't start working in the wrong order. Okay, so first things first is let's make a script. So to create a script, you can go down here into your project folder, and then I would make it in scripts if I were you, just for organization's sake, but you don't necessarily have to. And you can see that there's already a couple in here. These handle this one handles spawning in random obstacles, which is disabled right now, and then the other one is handles your score going up, which appears in the top left of your game here. So we're going to create a new one that our player can use. So if you right click, you'll get this nice menu. You can go to create and then C# script. And then you can name it whatever you want. I'm going to name it player because it's going on the player. So as a show of hands, who here has never programmed anything before? That this is entirely okay. Then what languages, I guess, have you guys used, if you don't mind me asking? Yeah.
Java.
Yep, Java. Okay. C#, nice.
Starting with HTML, CSS, JavaScript.
Okay. I think you can actually make JavaScript. You can use JavaScript scripts. Most people don't. I think less than. Are they deprecating it?
They're trying to go to only C#.
Oh, nice. JavaScript is not very nice to use in this. They used to have another one. They used to have Boo, and then they chopped that. So I guess now they're chopping JavaScript. Yeah, it was not much. So yeah, C# is the way to go. If you've used Java before, C# is basically Java. It's incredibly similar. So if you've used Java, this will be a walk in the park. So, so now that you've made your script, you can go ahead and double click on it. And depending on what you have as your default editor, your default IDE, you'll get a different screen. Mine is probably mono-develop. There's a There's an ever-raging war about mono-develop versus Visual Studio. It's kind of just up to preference. I use mono-develop because that's the first one that opened, and I was like, may as well get used to it. So it's just kind of up to you. Okay, so this is the default script that opens up when you create a new script. So first things first, everybody knows what functions are, right? It's
or method.
Nothing new. Yeah, or methods. Either naming thing. Okay, then that actually makes this a lot easier because then I probably don't need to explain as much about this. But the main things that we want to use in this is start. So start will always run when the scene is loaded. So if you have an object in the scene, the moment you load into the scene, or if you're starting in the scene, the moment the game starts, this is run once. This is really useful for initialization. So if you've got a value that you need to set at 0 at the start of the game, this is the place you'd want to do it. There's also something called awake. I should zoom in, by the way. Whoops. That's probably easier to see. There's also something called awake. And what awake does is it runs when the object is enabled, basically. So it's not necessarily at the start of the game. So if your object starts out disabled, that you can't see it or you can't interact with it, and then you enable it at some point, awake will run then. Whereas start will always run at the beginning of the scene regardless of whether it's there or not, basically. So they work almost the same, but you might run into a situation where you need to use awake instead of start. Usually start just works fine. Then there's also update. So update is the important one. So this is run every frame of the game. There's a really important thing, though, that you need to consider, and that is that there's update and fixed update. Okay? So update runs once every frame. Fixed update runs once every physics frame, basically. So when update runs every frame, that means that if your game is running slowly because it's lagging and the screen is only updating 3 times a second, update will only be running 3 times a second. So it doesn't run at necessarily a consistent speed. Fixed update runs at a fixed interval because that's when the physics engine is updating. So if you put the same value going up by a certain number in update and fixed update, they will go up at different rates because they're essentially different. The reason this is important is because the graphics update with the update function. So if you're doing something that, for instance, works with the camera, you should be using update, not fixed update. Because if you use fixed update, you might get some weird jitter because it's not doing it at the same rate. If you're modifying something physics-wise, you always want to use fixed update. Because if you use update, you might get some weird behavior. So we don't actually, yes?
So if you'd want to translate some object, you want to use fixed update?
No. That's actually what I want to talk about.
I mean like gravity or something?
Yeah, oh, yes. Okay, so if
translates down.
If you're using an object that has physics applied to it, you want to use fixed update for that stuff. We're not using physics today. We're not going to be using the physics engine. There's going to be no gravity. We're not going to be dealing with forces. What we're going to do is we're just going to change the position. We're just going to be modifying the transform. So we're going to be translating our player side to side. We're going to be rotating them in circles to make it look nice, you'll see. And if we wanted to change the scale, you'd do it in update. If you had an object if you had a bouncy ball that you were playing with in your scene, and you wanted it to move to the side, you'd use fixed update because that handles with physics as it's being applied. Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay, so we can go ahead and get rid of fixed update. We don't need to worry about that at all. So I'd like to start with some of the variables that are super useful with Unity. First of all, doubles. Don't use them. Ever. Just don't bother using doubles. Unity uses floats for all of its calculations. There are basically 0 times when it actually uses a double for anything. So if you try and use a double to keep track of some value, you'll probably end up having to convert it to a float at some point anyways. So unless you're using like a score mechanic, where all it's doing is just you're putting it on the screen or something, you're not using it with Unity's calculations at all, then yeah, you can use a double, but most of the time you'd want to use a float. So reminder, a float is a value like 1.4, like 5, like 1 point, a lot of, no, not an R. That's not gonna work. A bunch of numbers, that's a float. There's also ints. This will be quick, I promise. Ints don't have any decimal points, so it's like 2, 45, a bunch of numbers, but you can't put a decimal point in anything else. That's not an int. And then finally, bools are also really useful. And all a bool is it's either true or false. So that's our sort of binary values. And that's useful for things like with the project last week, you could jump. So it would check if you were grounded. And so grounded was a variable that was just either true or false. It said, are you grounded or are you not grounded? There was no reason to say 0 for grounded, 1 for not, because what would you use 2 or the rest of the numbers for? So that's why Booleans are nice. So, yes.
Float and ints can also be negative.
Yes.
That might have already been obvious.
Yeah, that's that's true. I probably should have put that as part of the example, that those can totally be negative. So, let's see. Another thing that's important is the concept of private versus public. So, if I make variables in Unity are by default private. So if you don't put one of those at the beginning, it will be private. So if, let's say I made a private int test, all right? And let's say I made a public int test2. So right now, this player script, what's the difference? Basically, the difference is that the public variable is you can use from other objects. So if you have another object that wants to change that, you can change it because it's public. You wouldn't be able to change it if it's private. But Unity also has a really useful feature for public. And that is if you save this, you need to make sure you save the script before you go back into Unity, or else it won't update there. If you go back into Unity, it should update. And now if we select our player object and we add the script, once my laptop finishes loading, and you can do this by dragging it in or adding it with add component like we did last week, you can see that test2 actually shows up in our inspector as 0. So if I set this to 5 and then I started the game, in the script test2 would be set to 5. So public variables let you set things from inside your inspector. So if you have a value like player speed, you don't have to go into your code and change the number each time you want to try something new. You can do it from the inspector. And you can even do it while the game is playing. You can update those values. So that's really useful when it comes to variables that you would want to change a lot, basically. And then finally, you guys all know what if-else is, right? If-else statements. I don't need to go over those.
So
cool. Yeah.
I'm trying to drag the player script into the player object, but it says this action will lose the prefab connection. Are you sure you wish to continue? What does that mean?
That means that basically the change that you're making to this object in your scene is making it different from the prefab that we have set in our project. This is a player prefab. You can make another player. But it shouldn't be if you're just dragging in the script. Where are you dragging the script into?
Just
into the object?
the mesh player and ridge body. So what I was doing is I clicked on the player, I dragged the script in between somewhere here, then this text box shows up.
Is anybody else doing that when they drag it in?
You can try
It shouldn't matter if you're overriding if you're making it not a prefab anymore. That should not make a difference. The prefab just made it easier if somebody accidentally deleted their player or something. So that shouldn't really matter. So you should be able to go ahead with that. So that's the most important difference for public and private. Do we have any questions about those? Yes.
So when you clicked on the player model,
Mhm.
and then it had to drop down for the player script, it says you can change the 5 number.
Mhm.
When you run it, will it change the number on the class? Or
What do you mean? Like,
because when you like backspace and put 3, will that just like run it as that number 3, or will it modify the script?
so it will run it using the number 3 put into there, but it's not necessarily just putting that into the script, because here, if I have the game actually running, it's using the number 3 for that variable. If I change it to 1, it is now using 1. So it's really useful for stuff like player movement speed, because you can modify it on the go and test and see which values you really want. But as a reminder to everybody, if you weren't here last week, changes you make while the game is playing will not save over. So if I decide that 1 is the speed I want, and then I stop playing it, it will go back to 3. So you need to remember to change it back if that's the value you want to use. Yes?
What's the point of using private? Oh, sorry. Yeah, why would you ever use private?
Private, you don't necessarily want values in here. If you have, for instance, the grounded Boolean from last week that I said is true if you're on the ground, false if you're not, you want to save that across your script, but you don't necessarily want it to be visible in the inspector. There's no reason for it to be. So you would just not bother making it public. Basically, don't put public or private unless you're putting public for variables that you want to change from the inspector. It's basically the general scheme of it, yes.
Would public mostly be like modifiable stats then?
Most of the time that's public. Or you can also use it for debug. So here, for instance, if I start this off by saying test2 is equal to 5, and that's what I do at the beginning of the project, when the scene is loaded, I set that to 5. And then my computer eventually updates. Yeah. Quickly.
Is there a keyword protected?
I think there is. You shouldn't need to use it.
I don't know if it mattered, but I know in Java there's a keyword protected, which is somewhere in between public and private.
Yeah, you shouldn't need to use that. There's a lot of coding stuff that exists in C# that you just don't need to deal with Unity. Remember, this is not a workshop on coding. This is a workshop for basically writing scripts in Unity, so it's not necessarily all coding stuff. So the reason I changed that, so now it's setting it to 5. So if I press play, and it eventually runs, you'll see that now it says 5 here. So that's actually, public variables can actually be useful for debug as well. So if I have a value that's changing, but it's not showing on the screen, I can just make it public, and then I can look in the inspector and I can see it changing.
And it shows you as you're playing.
Yes. So as another quick example, if I go here and I say test2 ++, which if you don't know is shorthand for just saying test2 is equal to test2 plus 1. We could probably have a second workshop going that does their part while my computer's loading from this workshop, and we could probably switch back and forth and like get double as much done. But yeah, it's kind of a sorry about that. So now if you look in the bottom right here, you can see that this test2 is going up very quickly. So it changes as the game's going. And if I set that to 0, then it would continue from there, because I just changed the public variable while it was running.
So So like if it's speed or something, you can make it so it slowly speeds you up as you get further and further.
Yeah, and it's just useful for seeing it there. There's also debug actual commands that you don't need to make them public, but a lot of the time making it public is just quicker. But if you're using it for debug and then you find out it's working, don't forget to change it back, because variables that shouldn't be public, you probably just shouldn't have as public, because I imagine that when you're writing a script and it gets longer and longer, you'll have a lot of public variables that you have to fill in. And if you've got ones that aren't useful, they'll just take up space and it'll become more confusing to look at. So, let's get started with actually writing our code. So, let me do this. So, first of all, we can make it so that our player moves side to side. So, right off the start, we should probably have some variable that we can use to keep track of how fast we want our player to be moving. So I'm going to go ahead and make a public float move speed. So this just would keep track of how fast we want to move. If we set our, so now from the inspector, we can set our move speed to 100 or 5 or whatever we want, and that'll update. So we don't have to keep coming in here and manually changing the move speed. So we can modify now the transform of this object. So if you remember, going back here, the transform is this component that's in all game objects that has a position, rotation, and scale. So in order to move our character, we can just move along the x-axis. As you can see, the x in the top right is moving. And that would be moving side to side. So what we can do is we can modify our transform. So if you type transform with a lowercase t, this is now accessing the transform component attached to our game object. So we can say our transform dot position. So this is a part of the component. And then we can set it equal to something new. So does anybody have any questions of what that's doing right there? That we're just changing the position part of the transform. We're just changing those 3 values. So those 3 values are actually something called a vector 3. So all of vector 3 is it's just an array of 3 objects. That's literally it. But it's used for position, rotation, scale, and a lot of other things. And basically it's just the x, y, and the z values of something. So here we want to set our new x, our new y, and our new z. So for the x, we don't want to set it to our move speed. Because if we set it to our move speed, our character will just, if we set it to 10, our character will just jump over to 10 and stand still. So we want to set it to our old position. So we can do, goodness, stop covering that. We can do transform dot position dot x. So that gets our old x value. And then we can add our move speed and that's it for the x if we want to do that. So all that's doing is it's saying we're now setting the position to a new vector, a new xyz, with the x being the old x plus our speed. So who sees a problem with just leaving this as is, ignoring the fact that we don't have the y and the z? Yes. Yes, it has nothing to do with our input. It has nothing to do with what we are doing. So to fix that, we can go over input really quickly. So to get input, Unity makes it pretty easy. So I'm going to create a new float and call it horizontal, because I want to get the horizontal axis that we're using. So there's a few different ways to use input. So if you just do input with a capital I, you'll be accessing Unity's input. And you can do dot, and then you can use the get commands usually. And you can do a lot of different things with these. So you can use something like get key to get, for instance, the S key or the Alt key or getting specific keys on a keyboard, you can use get button. And what get button does is it uses a button by name, and you can use get axis, which is by name. Now the names for these are actually in our project under project setting. Yes, okay. So if you go to edit in the top left in our inspector or our projects, you can go into project settings, and right at the top will be input. And you'll see on the right that this has changed. And under axes, you'll see that we have a ton of different values for different buttons and different axes that we're controlling. So for instance, yes.
Can you repeat what you just did?
Yes, edit in the project settings near the bottom, and input right at the top.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yeah, feel free to stop me if I'm going too fast and ask for clarification. That's totally fine. So here, if we, for instance, bring down horizontal, we can see that there's a lot of different values for this. But what's important is the name being horizontal and the actual controls of it. So I don't know, this allows key or mouse button, and I think Unity has pre-built defaults for that. But if we go past an actual axis and we go to a button, so like Fire 1, you should see that we have positive button here, and we can see that the default is left control. Now if you notice, not only is there Fire 1, but down here there's also Fire 1. There's two Fire 1s. The reason there's two Fire 1s is because one of them is for keyboard controls, the other is for controller input, if you're using a controller to play. So, in this situation, since we want to move side to side, we want to use the horizontal axis. That's basically A or D if you're using WASD, left or right arrow key, or if you had a controller, left or right on the joystick. Since we're moving side to side, that makes the most sense. So here, we can go back into our script, and we can use input.get axis, and then we need to give it a string, so we actually just give it horizontal, spelled correctly with a capital H, as our value. And that will get the current value in that input at that time, which is -1 to 1 is the range for the axes. So if it's -1, we're holding left. If it's 1, we're holding right. Any questions about that? Okay, so get axis gives us a value. I'm just going to draw this real quick, make this easier, because this is kind of important. So this is -1, this is 0, this is 1. So get axis gives us any value from this range. It can be here, 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 it can be here. Does anybody see a problem with using this with keyboard controls?
If the whole negative and 1, then we get -1. Or
No, not necessarily. The problem is keyboard controls, you can't actually hold a button. You can't hold down the A key just a little bit and have it only go over a little bit. So it's not necessary to have all of these values for a keyboard. And actually, if you hold down the A key, the value actually moves over time to -1. It's not a long time, but it's still probably a half second that it goes from 0 to -1, or a quarter second or something. We don't necessarily need that for this because we're using keyboard controls. So a possibly better way of doing it is to use getAxis raw. And what getAxis raw does is it basically just removes all of these intermediate values completely. And when you hold left, you instantly get -1. When you hold right, you instantly get 1. If you're not holding anything, it's instantly 0, which is much better for keyboard controls. A lot of people working with Unity have this problem where their input feels really sluggish, because when you're using the keyboard controls, it takes a while to move from 0 to -1 or -1 to 1 or whatever you're doing. This just makes it so that it moves much quicker and feels much more responsive. But you can play with this as you want. When we actually get it running, you can play with it that maybe you want it to be very quick and responsive. Maybe you want it to be a bit slower to look nicer. You know, it's up to you. But I'm going to be using get access raw because I'd like it to look nice, or not look nice, but to play nice. Yes.
Is there a value you can change in the code in order to make get access like extra sluggish or something?
Yeah, I
Out
mean,
of curiosity.
yes, actually, yes, there is. There is under these. That was the stuff that I said kind of ignore, and that is the stuff like the gravity, the dead area, the sensitivity, that kind of stuff. That if you modify that, it will change how it moves and how it's affected.
Okay.
So yes. I have not personally had to do that with any of my games, with making the input more sluggish, but I mean, you
I know, just in case, like, you wanted to increase the difficulty by making it more sluggish or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, you totally can.
Make your vehicle feel heavier to drive.
So here, at our value that we started before, of changing the position, we can now take our movement speed and we can multiply it by our horizontal value now. So this is the input. So this is now moving from -1 to 1. So we'd be taking our position, let's say our position is 5 and our movement speed is 2. We'd either be staying at 5, moving to -3, or moving to 3, or moving to 7, because we'd be adding our movement speed of 2 times either 0, 1, or -1. So we're either not moving, moving left, or moving right. Does that make sense? Okay, there's actually one more thing we want to multiply this by, which some people forget, but it's very important. And that is what's called time.delta time. Right here. So to explain this, basically, because update runs every frame, if you're lagging, if it's only updating very slowly, you'll only be moving very little amount. That's not necessarily a good thing. So by multiplying by time.delta time, what that means is it's multiplying by the time since the last frame happened. Which means if you have a lag spike where suddenly you're updating very slowly, you'll still move the same amount during that time, regardless of how many frames are going, because it'd be a bigger time.delta time to multiply by. So by doing this, it makes your game much more consistent regarding distance. Does that make sense? You don't necessarily want it for everything, but a lot of the time if you're using update and you're doing something every frame, it's a good idea to multiply by that. Zoom out so you can at least see the rest of that line. So I'm just going to continue the same line on the next slot so you guys can see the old line, but you guys don't have to do this. You can just continue writing on a long line. But now we just need to do the y and the z. So to set the y and the z, all we need to do is just use the existing y and the existing z. Yes?
One question. Couldn't we have just set transform position.x to transform position.x plus move speed times horizontal times time delta time instead of just creating a vector?
Thank you for asking that, because Unity, as nice as it is, sometimes does things very dumb. And that is, if I take transform.position.x, this is actually a read-only variable, so you can't actually set it to whatever you want. You have to set the whole position. It's kind of goofy, but that's how it works.
Okay.
There's also you can do a few different ways of movement. You can also do transform.translate, which basically says just add a new vector 3, and you can do it like that. But sometimes it's better to use to just set it to a new equals, depending on what you're doing, since translate is only adding something each frame, whereas sometimes you want to set things each frame. So, but yeah, you can't just take .x. I wish you could. I really wish you could. It'd be nice. But unfortunately, you can't.
I'm sorry, I was just thinking it was unnecessary to include Y and Z. They're not being updated.
No, logically it doesn't make sense, but that's just the syntax that you have to do. So, does everybody have this written down now in their thing? Okay, then I encourage you to go back, select your player, change their speed to some value, and press play and see what it does when you hold left or right. Hopefully it works. I mean, my computer takes forever to update, so. Does anybody have it working? Is it moving? It is? Okay, sweet. I did something right. I'll be able to check in 20 minutes or so when I get mine to actually work. I think, what was my speed? I had my speed at 10 as a good speed. So you probably won't be able to tell right now if your object is moving if you're in the game view, because the camera, or no, you will. You definitely will. Never mind. Yeah, the camera's not following it. So you should have your player being able to move left and right. Yes.
Is there a way to set a limit for the X position so that it doesn't go off screen, so that
yes,
it just like sort of disappears?
Yes,
somewhere?
Yeah, there's a few ways you could do it. One of the ways is you could just set you don't have to write this. You can set like if transform.position.x is greater than whatever my max x is, then you can do something like x is now, I'm just writing this shorthand, but the idea would be you could set the x now equal to whatever my whatever that variable is. That you can say if it's trying to be greater than that position, bring it back and just set it to the max.
Okay.
That way it will never actually move past the maximum. So yeah, you could do something like that. So right now we have the problem of our camera does not follow our character right now, which is kind of a problem. So quick solution would be to attach the camera onto the player. But we don't want to do that for, I'll show you soon why we don't want to necessarily do that. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to make our character look a little bit nicer when they're moving. Right now, our ship just kind of moves left and right very statically, and it doesn't look very pretty. So I want to try and make it look a little bit nicer as it goes. So my idea for this game is, what if I had the ship actually rotate as it moved left? So if it moved left, it rolled left in the air, and when it moved right, it rolled right into the air. So how would we go about doing that? Well, luckily, transform has a position, but it also has a rotation and a scale. We're not doing scale. So if we want to do our rotation, we can just set it up very similarly. So we can make another float for, I'm going to call this spin speed, because that's the speed that we'd be spinning. And then I can start modifying the rotation. So rotation is, now we get some of the fun stuff that nobody likes to talk about. Has anybody ever heard of a quaternion? They're gross. They're really nasty. Basically, it's like a vector 3, but instead of an XYZ, it has an XYZ and W. I'm not going to try and explain them. They're goofy, but they're done to make mathematics a lot easier with calculating angles and all that. Rotation uses a quaternion when it's actually doing its calculations. So we can't actually say transform.rotation is equal to new vector 3, because rotation isn't actually a vector 3. So rather what we're going to do is we're going to use transform.EulerAngles. And all that does is it just basically converts the rotation to a vector 3 in x, y, z, which is considered, or is it Euler? Is it Euler angles?
Yeah,
Am I stupid? I always call it Euler. I'm going to call it Euler. You just got to deal with it, I guess. That's not Euler. That doesn't look like Euler, so I'm not going to call it that. Because, meh. So, we can now set this to, let's say, new vector 3. So we can do something very similar. So we have already got our horizontal value for input. So we can set the x to our current rotation. So transform.EulerAngles.x plus our spin speed times our input, horizontal, times time.delta time again. This is basically just the exact same thing we did before, except this time using the rotation instead of the position and using the spin speed instead of the move speed. And then next up we can just use, actually I'm not going to set this to the current rotation because rotation can be really janky sometimes, especially if it's oriented certain ways, and it might mess up our orientation, so I'm just going to force it to always stay at the same y and z. So I'm going to put it at 90 and 90. That's what it's currently set at. So the reason I put F is because this is shorthand for, if you guys know casting, this is shorthand for writing float 90, so it doesn't interpret it as an int. Easy way to do that is to just add an F after the number, and it'll always use it as a float. Does anybody have any questions so far?
If the thing has a red line under it, does that mean it's incorrect?
Yes, usually.
My spin speed has a red line under it.
Did you create it at the top?
I'm not sure.
It should be above start that we put.
Oh, those are
Yeah. So go ahead and see if this works. So spoiler, I don't think it will, so don't panic if it doesn't. I'm pretty sure this doesn't. And I'll explain why, sort of, because I'm not entirely sure why we need to do this, but we do, because Unity's goofy. And it has to do with quaternions and math. So what?
It rotates more one way than the other.
Yeah.
And then it stops, right? Yes. So that's, I do want to show it at least. I had my spin speed set on. Goodness, I had it like 500. I don't know if that's going to be really fast or not. Oh, mine keep. Nope. There it stopped. So it's kind of hard to see because of the frame rate, but your object will rotate a certain way, and then it will just stop rotating. At least, especially if you have something lower, let me put it lower so it's more obvious. Yeah, you see it just sliding along there? That's because the way, with quaternions and Euler angles, yeah, I'm going to call it that, Euler angles, the math sometimes will get into a spot where it can't continuously rotate because of clamping or something. It's kind of just a mess. So we can actually just fix that pretty easily with something that, frankly, it's weird as to why it's necessary, but it is. So we can do that by instead of modifying here our x rotation, we can just keep our own vector that we want to use that's not using. We can just keep our own separate. So what I'm going to do is at the top, I'm going to set a vector 3 And I'm just going to call it V3 to make it easier to keep track of. And in our start, we can set this to a certain value. So we can say v3.x is equal to, I have it starting as -150, and our y as 90. Is it 90 or 90? Yeah, it's 90. And our z as 90 as well. So the reason we can just modify the x, y, and z of this, but not the position, is because the position specifically has those values as read-only, whereas a normal vector 3, if you're just creating one, you can totally modify these all you want. And so then all we have to do to fix it is we can just modify our vector3.x here, and we can just set it to this value, or we can add it to this value, sorry. So I'm sure you guys have used the plus equals operation before, and that's basically just saying v3.x is equal to v3.x plus this new value that we're giving it. And then for the next line, to make it real easy, we can just set it equal to v3. So this is just due to Unity's janky rotation stuff with quaternions and math. I'm sure if I knew more about quaternions and someone else knew more about quaternions, we could probably write it much better. But this should work now that it should be able to rotate all we want. Does anybody have any questions that aren't about quaternions? Or are? I just won't be able to answer them. Nope? Yes.
I deleted the whole old chunk for V3 and made the transform command under red. But I also replaced it with the new V3 that we set out.
Do you have semicolons?
Yes.
Because that happens to be a lot of the time. I'll miss a semicolon in the next line. It always shows the next line as being the error, and I'm like, I don't see a problem with this line. Well, it's because the one before it. So now if you head in, you should hopefully see that the player no longer gets stuck at a certain angle and will instead continuously rotate. Does anybody, it does do that? It doesn't get stuck anymore?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. Then I won't test it yet. I want to do something else. So, right now, we want our camera to follow our player. Because right now our camera's, right now our player is moving off screen, and we don't want that. So, one easy way to make our camera follow our player is to make the camera a child of our player. So we have our main camera underneath our player. And then we can go ahead and play it, and our camera will follow our player. And it's great. It's all great. Nothing's wrong.
The camera rotates with my player.
Yep, it sure does.
That's a problem.
That certainly is. So we don't want our camera to be rotating with the player. So this is why making the camera a child of your player is not always a good idea, because it takes everything from the transform. It takes the position, it bases it off the position, the rotation, and also the scale, actually. If you modify the scale, it will also move the camera based on that. So sometimes if your player is doing anything other than moving its position, you probably don't want to just attach it as a child if you want it to follow. Yeah?
Is there some way to override the camera rotation? Or like the rotations of the player so that it doesn't rotate?
Well, the problem necessarily with that is if I set the camera, if I made a script for the camera that just always set its rotation to be 0, the camera would stay oriented correctly, but it would still move around the player because the position is still based on the rotation as well, if that makes sense. So the easiest way is to just write a script that the camera just follows the player on its own.
Okay.
As something completely separate. So we're going to separate that out. the camera, so it's no longer a child.
You can also play around with the hierarchy and possibly, like, let's say you made like a parent object and you made both the player and the camera like civil.
Yes,
Followed,
you could do that with. You would just need to probably move the parent object rather than the player at that point.
and then rotate.
Rotate the individual player, but not move the player. You'd want to move the parent, which is a way to do it, and that might be easier, but it kind of just depends on how you're setting up your game. A lot of this is down to preference. I'm just showing one way to do it. So now we can write a new script. So we've got our player done, and our player is handling all that. So now we can make a camera script. So I'm going to call this CameraFollow because it's the script that lets our camera follow our player.
Could you just create a new script then?
Yes, that's just a brand new script called whatever you want. I mean, you can call it something relating to camera. I would not do lowercase camera as the name because I think there's already something called camera written like that, and that might give you an error. So just call it something other than that. And then you can go ahead and open it. Eventually. Yeah, as I'm sure you guys can tell, I don't usually do game dev on here. I do it on my desktop because, yeah. Like I said, I may as well be working on 2 games at that point and just using the build time from one to work on the other. So here we've got our camera script. So the idea behind this is we can set it so that our camera follows directly behind the player. So when they move together. But I want to get a little bit more creative with our camera. So I want to make it obvious that we're moving even without points of reference. So what we can do for that is we can set it so that there's a dead space in our camera, not unrelated to the game. So we can set it so that our player's here and our camera's watching them. We can set it so that when the player moves to the left, the camera doesn't move until the player gets closer to the edge of the screen. Then the camera follows them. And if they go back right, it doesn't follow them until it gets close. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm using my hands, so it's kind of goofy. But I don't know how else better to show that. So if somebody could draw that idea on the whiteboard, go for it. But that's kind of the idea I want to do for this. So what we can do is we can set up a few different things. So first of all, we're going to need to get access to our player object. So we're going to need to be able to use them. So what we can do is we can simply use a game object. So a game object variable is just a game object. Like you set it as the object literally in the inspector. You can just use that. So I'm going to do a game object and I'm going to call it player. So to set that player to the right one, to the correct player, I can go into start. And I can say player is equal to, and then I want to somehow find this player in our scene. Well, luckily Unity has that covered, so I can simply use GameObject dot find, and I'm going to do find GameObject with tag as one of the options, and I'm simply going to use the tag of player. So what this does is it goes into all of our game objects and it finds the first one tagged player, which is our player. Wow, that's crazy. So this will now set it to the correct game object that we can use that object's transform, position, and rotation, and whatever else we need to use. So you can use GameObject.find and give it the name of the object. You can use find object with tag. You can use find objects with tag and get an array, a list basically of all the objects with that tag. You can do a lot with it. I would not do this at runtime much because if you have 50 game objects in your scene and you're running every frame, find the one labeled player, you're going to probably slow it down if you do that with multiple objects. So a better way is to set it at the start, so it only runs once, sets that reference correctly, and then you can use it for the rest of the game. Okay, so now here's where the gross stuff comes in a little bit. But so I'm also going to make a public float for our move distance, for the amount that we want to allow our camera to not move, basically. So I'm going to call this, I guess I'll call it dead space, since it's kind of the dead space in the camera. But again, that nothing to do with the game. So now, basically what I want to do is I want to check if our player's position is, our player's X position is too far from the camera's X position, and if it gets too far, to move the camera over to make up for that. Does that make sense? So what I want to do is, first of all, I want to check if the player is moved too far. So I can use an if, and I can say if our current object's transform position X minus the player's, so player dot transform dot position dot X is greater than our, hello, shut up, I don't need an update, thank you, is greater than our dead space variable. Then do blank. So all we're saying is if the difference between those is too big, so our person's moved too far away from the camera, then we just want to move the camera over, is basically all we're doing with that. So this is actually only covering to the right or left. Right, left. It's covering one of the directions. We need to also cover the other direction. So what we can do is we can use an if or an else if, and we can do the exact same thing. I'm actually even going to copy and paste it, except this time it's less than the negative dead space. So this way it covers to the left and to the right, because we want to set it differently based on which way is which. You could probably get creative and write this in one statement using absolute values and math, but I'm not doing that, and I don't expect you to do it, so we're going to do it this way and just split it up. I can zoom in a little bit more. No, I can't. Does anybody have any questions, or who needs more time to write this out? Anybody? Okay, go ahead.
Can you go back to the on your script?
Sure, I can jump back for a second. What's up? Is it not working?
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And again, I will be uploading a complete version of this. Basically, with this code, I'll comment it to explain a little bit of what's going on, and I'll upload a full version of the game. So if your computer crashes or something, you can still get the full version and check it out and reverse engineer some stuff if you want. So I'm going to go ahead and start writing in what we actually need to modify. So when this object is far enough away, I can set our position equal to, just like we did before, a new position. So all we need to do for our new position is we can use our player's X position, X space position, not lore. No. like exposition. Never mind, I'm done. I need to have a sit. So we can set it to our player's X position, and we can just add our dead space onto that. So if our dead space is 2, and our player is now moving past 2 away, we can just set it equal to 2 behind the player, basically, or 2 in front of, depending on which direction we're going. So that's our X. I'm gonna put it on the next line so you can see all of it at once. You don't need to. And then for our Y, we don't want to modify either of those, so we can just use transform.position.y, transform.position.z. And then after we've written that, we can also just paste it for the second bit, except this time all we need to change is that instead of adding our dead space, we need to subtract it. And that will cover the other direction. So after you've written this, feel free to open up the project in Unity, attach the script onto the camera, give it a value, and see if it works. I'm going to leave this up so people can catch up. It's kind of a big old block of code. I'll space it out a little bit so it might be easier to keep track of what's what. Does everybody understand what I'm doing with this? I mean, it's again, it's kind of just, you could also just set the position equal to, but I want to make this look a little bit nicer, which is why I'm doing a little bit of matrix math or vector math or whatever you want to call it.
Do you add the script to the camera or the player?
The camera. So this script needs to find the player and use those values. So we want to put it on the camera. So the camera will find the player object, and then it will, for the rest of the game, use those values to set its own position. So if you give it a dead space of 0, it will actually just set its value basically equal to the player's. So it will follow it perfectly without any give. What's up?
The code works, but the shape kind of wobbles as it moves from the far left or far right.
It wobbles? Is it rotating completely?
Yeah. Yeah. It seems to kind of just shape just.
We can't. I didn't have that issue when I was working on it at home. That might be the case actually. That it's probably being jittery. Yeah. Okay then. So fun fact. There's another function that I forgot to talk about. Thank you for that. That's called late update, and basically what late update is it's the exact same as update. It just runs after all of the updates are done. So it just is done afterwards. So this would be done after the player has moved. So it should reduce jitteriness. Does it? Okay, sweet. Yeah, maybe I just didn't notice that when I was setting this up. Or my laptop just wouldn't even show it anyways because it's already so jittery it doesn't matter. Either way. So yeah, I would change update to late update if you're seeing the camera be jittery.
Yes, it's much more smooth now.
So does anybody still need time to write code? We're all good? Yeah, go for it. I think I had the dead space as, I think I just had it at 1. That 1 gives it a bit of give, but it's not distracting. Yes?
Can you repeat why you use
Mm-hmm. So all the late update function does is update runs through all of the objects every frame. Then late update runs just after update. So it does the exact same thing. It's at the exact same timing as update. It runs at the same frequency, but it's just done after all of the updates are done. So it's useful for stuff like camera controls to make sure that the player moves, then the camera moves with the player, and then that's it. If you just have them both as update, they might go in different orders. So the player might move, the camera might update, then the camera might update, then the player might update. So it might, that's why it looks jittery as it goes, because they're not going at the same timing necessarily. So that's why late update makes that look much better. Yes. It's not moving it. Did you attach it to the camera?
Yeah.
And it's not moving at all? Oh no, that's good. Okay, so what that means is once it's gotten to the edge, now the camera's just following along with the player, so it shouldn't look like it's moving. That's all that means. So yeah, that's what it should look. I'll show what it should look. Are you done? Ready? Okay. Because now I do need to move on. So I'm going to, in case you haven't done this, I'm going to add the camera script. Once this loads, come on. I'm going to add the camera script to our camera. I'm going to give it a dead space of 1. And when I run it, ideally, there we go. So now I've got it so that if I look at it in scene view, I can, and if it still wants to let me play, slow. You know, let me just separate these out real quick. If I look at this in scene view, I can see that while I'm moving inside the dead space. So if the dead space is a little bit bigger so you can see it easier, then the camera is staying still right here. But once I move to the edge, the camera starts following it. It will be more obvious as to what it's doing once we get the obstacles coming, so we get a point of reference. Yes?
How did you create 2 separate screens?
The game and the scene screen, are just separate tabs, and you can separate them out. So actually, my usual setup for this is I have the hierarchy over here. I have, this is going to look really janky. I have the project and console up here, and then I actually have these split up like this, with this about as far over as it goes. So I usually have it set up so that I can work in the scene and then also see the game screen at the bottom. But I'm keeping it at the default because
it looks confusing.
Yeah, it looks confusing if you're not used to how that's set up. So, oh goodness, I gotta fix everything now. Yeah, I can do default. Well, I think this is about what it was, so it should be fine. So yeah, so we've now got our character moving. They spin, so it looks nice, and we've got our camera following them pretty decently. So I'm pretty happy with that. So now we can actually move on to the obstacles. So oh, jeez. We can now move on to the actual point of this game, which is dodging the obstacles. So if you go into our prefabs, we can drag on an obstacle for our player. So I'm going to drag it roughly ahead of the player. So I'm going to run into it. But as of right now, the problem is this game is a little bit too easy. It's a little bit too easy. I mean, I hardly have to try, and I'm just dodging everything. I'm not even getting close to getting hit. And that's because nothing's moving. So we could set it so that our player moves, or like I said before, we can set it so that our obstacle moves towards us. So what we can do is we can create an obstacle script to attach to that. So once again, create C# script, and I'm just going to name this obstacle. And then you can go ahead and open it up so we can start modifying it. Okay. So I'm going to open up this. Now we've got our obstacle script. So all we want is we want our object to move in a certain direction, basically. Pretty simple. So here I'm just going to create a public float. I'm going to name it speed for the speed that it moves. So we can modify basically how difficult we want our game to be. If we give it a really high speed, it'll seem as if your character's moving very quickly and it'll be harder to dodge. If we give it a lower speed, it'll be much easier. And then all we need to do in update is we can use transform, and then I'm actually going to switch it up and I'm going to use translate. This is what I mentioned before. So because all we're doing is we're just moving in one direction and we don't really care about the rest of it, we can use translate. It's a little bit less useful for players since there's, you have to worry about the rotation and the Y and the Z and how that'll work. This is much easier, so we can just put translate. We don't want to move in the Z direction. The Z is side to side. We don't want to move up and down. We just want to move we don't want to move in the X. We want to move in the Z, which is the forward and backward, basically, from the camera. So then we can simply use negative speed. So if we set our speed to 100, it moves at negative 100. We wouldn't have to make them put a negative speed in the inspector. It makes more sense to just set it negative here. And then again, times time.delta time to make it consistent. So if we're spawning these objects and they're moving past us, what do you see as a problem that could come up right now is what we have. So we make one object, send it back. Make a second object, send it back. Make a third object, send it back. What's the problem we might run into?
There's just a bunch behind you.
Yes, our game will slow down as there's 14,000 blocks super far away behind us that keep going. So we want to get rid of those. Yes?
So you have the X and Y positions at 0. Wouldn't they just spawn in the same location?
No, because this is transform.translate, not setting the position. So we're not setting the position equal to something. Translate is just adding this value to our position.
Okay.
So it's just a different way of doing it. I like using translate as much as I can, but I believe translate is relative to the object. So if we put it onto our player and we tried to translate along the X, our player is currently rotated. So X would, and it's rotating. So if we translate along the X, we'd start moving in all sorts of janky directions, which we don't want to do.
But I mean, like, you can't just have all the boxes spawn in the same X and Y location, or
no, we're not having them spawn in the same location. This is just this is just adding the speed in the Z direction. So it's not changing any of the X or Z. It's just changing the Z, or it's not changing the X or the Y. Goodness, I can't talk. It's only changing the Z. So in order to make it so that these objects don't last infinitely, we can simply do a check. We can say if our transform.position.z is less than some arbitrary number, I had negative 100. So basically, if it's moved off camera and behind us, we can just delete it. We can destroy it. So a really helpful command for that is destroy. And we can simply say destroy this. which if you use Java before, this just references your current thing, object, yeah. So actually, if you ran this right now, it would not work. The reason for that is because this is currently pointing to this script. So it would remove the script from the object, so it would no longer move, but there'd still be a block back there. So you'd have 14,000 blocks all in a line now, instead of moving backwards. So to fix that, we can just say this.gameObject. And all that does is it just says the game object attached to this script right now, which is really the script attached to the game object, but it's still able to reference it. Yes?
You just put game object and omit this.
No. Game object, I don't think so.
Because I know in Java you can sometimes omit this.
Yeah, no, I know you can sometimes. I think if you put this, if you just put game object, it wouldn't work because I don't think that's reference correct. It might actually, I'm not sure. I've always used this, so if somebody wants to test that right now, they can, but I'm not gonna mess with it. So, does anybody need more time to see this? This code? It's pretty short. Obstacle's not very confusing. By the way, you can also just get rid of start if you want to, since we're not using it. Sure. You get a plus or a minus messed up, because if you get a plus or a minus, it'll start moving in really weird directions. Yeah, if you're not using start or update for this script, for a script, you can delete it or you cannot. It doesn't really matter. So I just, in obstacle, I just got rid of start since we're not using it. We're not setting anything at the start. Yes.
So like discovering the obstacles, can we disable the obstacles and do the same thing, or?
Well, if you disable an object, actually, it doesn't necessarily destroy it. So when you disable an object, you can always re-enable it. So it'll always still be there, and that data will still be taking up space. Destroying an object completely gets rid of any reference to it, so it's just gone. So if you, for instance, are playing, if you're making an FPS, so a shooter, and you have a machine gun and you shoot a bunch, you'd want to destroy the bullets because you're going to be shooting thousands of bullets by the end of the game. And if you're just disabling them, your inspector is going to have 1,000 game objects all listed out as disabled, which is just going to get really cluttered. So yeah, sometimes disabling it does work just as well if you're not continuously creating new objects. But for us, we're going to be continuously creating obstacles that are going to be spawning, so it would get cluttered really quickly. Yeah.
I tried to add the obstacle script to one of the prefabs, and I'm getting it can't add script error.
Can't add
script component obstacle because the script class cannot be bound. Make sure that there are no compile errors and that the bound name is class name match.
Do you have any errors in your script? Did you copy something down wrong?
I was trying to delete her.
So I'm just going to, I've attached the obstacle script to this obstacle object in our scene, and I set the speed to 5, which should be really, really slow if this works correctly. Hopefully it does.
Oh yeah.
It's pretty slow, and we go right through it. So nothing happens right now. Our objects are moving,
I see it.
and we do have we can dodge them, but right now it doesn't matter if we dodge them because there's nothing to get if we've actually touched them or not. So what we can do is we can look at our obstacle object. And first things first, we need to stop modifying this obstacle because we should be modifying the prefab. So if modifying the prefab will modify all obstacles, whereas just modifying the one won't change all of them. It'll only change this one. So actually, I would instead add the script to our prefab. So if you select it, you can see it just the same. and you can use add component to get our obstacle onto there and give it whatever you want. So that now by changing the prefab, if you look at the instance of it we have, it now has that script as well. And then on our prefab, we can actually change our box collider to isTrigger. So when a collider is not set to trigger, it's a solid object. If you take two of them and you put them together, they're going to knock off of each other. If one of them is set to a trigger, it doesn't have a solid collider, but it has a collider that's still used to figure out if something's touched it. So if you're making a racing game and you're trying to make waypoints that you're making sure the player's on the right track, so you've got one at the start, one halfway, one back at the start, that it's an invisible barrier that they pass through, you'd use a trigger because you don't want them to smash into your wall that, oh, you hit the start, bang, they're dead. You want it to so that they can just pass through it, but you still want to get the information that they've passed through it. So by setting it to a trigger, this object will no longer be interacted with. Do you know why? Can anyone guess as to why, even though it wasn't a trigger, I still passed right through it? Does anybody have a decent guess for that? Why that would happen? Well, it does have, both of these objects do have colliders on them. Yeah.
They weren't tagged to be able to interact.
That is a good guess because you can set certain tagged objects to not interact with each other, but that's not quite it. Yeah. That's it. So it's not actually, well, it's not that they're not rigid bodies. That's close, but it's the fact that we are setting we're setting the positions. So we're not giving it some force that it's going to hit it and bounce off. We are setting the positions manually. So if you take two objects and you set their positions to go through each other, they might try to bounce off of each other, but they're just going to be set further and further together. And they're not going to bounce off because you're continuously changing their position. If we set our player to be a physics object and to just stand still, that cube would come towards us and it would bounce us away. But because we're just setting their positions constantly, they can basically pass through whatever they want. Yeah.
My Unity, all it shows is a black screen, and if you try and click on anything that happens, did it just crash? Should I close out of it?
Probably, yeah, I would. Have you saved the scene recently? That's actually not that. That won't set you back that far because when you didn't save the scene, but you do have all of your scripts still. So all you might need to do is reattach some things and change some of the values. But yeah. Did you press play?
Yeah, I pressed play. Now the play button will cover off blue.
Did you put a loop somewhere?
No.
Because I've done that before. Right? I didn't realize I had an infinite loop in my game, and every time I ran it, it crashed, the whole program. I was really confused until I realized I was an idiot and just kept an infinite loop. So don't do that. So now that we've got our obstacle as a trigger, we need to somehow tell if we've hit it. So actually, we're going to be going back into our player script, and in our player script, we can tell if we've hit the object. So when I said that those were all the functions used in Unity, I lied. There are more. So this one is a really, really nice one, and it's void on trigger enter. And it has a collider, and it's usually just called other. You can name it whatever you want. Basically, what this function does, what this method does, is this is called whenever the object that this is attached to enters a trigger. On the frame that it touches it, on the frame that it's not in a trigger, and now in this frame it's in a trigger, it calls this. And the collider of the other is the trigger object that it's touching. So this is attached to our player. The collider other is going to be our obstacle. Does that make sense? Okay. So, my notes. So, first of all, you almost always want to check which object you're colliding with. In a lot of your games, you'll have different triggers, and if you don't check to make sure that you're touching the right object, you might finish the level by touching a coin, because you didn't check if it's the end of the level or a coin, which is a problem. Usually, maybe your game is based around, I don't know. But usually that's not a good idea. So we can just really quick check if this is set correctly. So I'm going to say if other dot name dot contains, and I'm going to put obstacle. So basically I'm checking if the other object is named obstacle. So can anyone guess as to why I'm not saying if other.name is equal to obstacle, why I'm saying contains? I mean, I wouldn't expect anybody to really know this. Maybe somebody knows. That's along the right idea, but the reason is because when we spawn in new ones, it actually calls them obstacle.copy or obstacle copy. So it always spawns in prefabs as obstacle copy with something else at the end of it. But you're right. If we wanted to name them obstacle 1, 2, 3, 4, it's the same exact idea that they all have obstacle in the name, just with different endings. So instead of saying equal to obstacle, we can just say contains. Makes it a little bit easier to tell what we're doing. So after that, we need to. So this is when we hit the obstacle. We need the game to end. So one of the easy ways to make the game end is it's kind of a goofy one, but for this case it's easier than trying to properly reload the scene because we might have lighting issues. I know that's always a thing. So rather than doing that, we can do a quick workaround, and we can set time dot timescale equal to 0. So time.timescale is the speed at which our game runs. If we set it's a default at 1. If we set it to 10, our game will run at 10 times the normal speed. If we set it to 0, our game stops. It basically just freezes. So that's actually useful for us because we can just have it, you hit the object, boom, you died, done. Yes?
Is there a way to just print a message to the screen?
Yes, there is, actually. That is one of the scripts that I included that I didn't want to go over today because we do only have 25 minutes left. I don't think this should take the rest, but after you go into the game, or back into your project and build it, you should notice that if you hit the obstacle and your obstacle has a trigger collider, that your game should stop. Can anybody confirm that?
Trigger collider.
Okay, it stops.
Set it to is trigger.
Yes.
Okay.
And you should do that on the prefab, not the instance in your game. That way it applies to everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now you have to figure out how to randomly spawn boxes
Yes.
around the player.
So I was considering whether to make that a part of it as well, part of this workshop of doing the random spawning and all that entails. But I decided to include the script, and we can go over that script, what that's doing, but we don't necessarily have to write it because it is a lot more. There's a lot more to it. So, but first of all, before I want to do that, what is in score? Okay, so actually, before we get into that, I want to open up Score Manager. So this is a script that I included. That is a pretty simple script. And all it does is there's two text objects in our game. One of them you should have noticed, it's the score in the top left. The other is the you died message that is currently invisible on the screen right now, but I want to put that in the screen when you die. So if you look at our at the Score Manager, you can see that we have our score text updating here, but then we also have this function called die that sets the def text object to true. It basically enables it so it's no longer invisible. Well, we're not calling that anywhere, so we should call that from somewhere where we hit the object. So wherever we detected that we hit the object, we should call the die function so that we know that we've hit it. So we did that back at our player. So this is just called die, and it's in Score Manager. So if we go to the player, we should just be able to call that. Now I'm going to call it before I set time scale to 0, because if I set time scale to 0 and then try and do actions, they might not happen because the game just stopped. So we don't want our game to stop and then try and pull up the you died screen, because that might not actually show up. So here, if we check our editor, we should see that we have an object called Game Manager. And this is currently disabled, but we can go ahead and enable it with this check mark next to the name. I had it disabled because I didn't want it messing up anything while we were trying to work. So this should enable the score. So if you were to press play, I believe the score would start updating rather than doing nothing. Yeah, so now our score is going up as we play. But what we care about is the name of this. We care about Game Manager and the fact that it has a Score Manager attached to it. So we can use our game object .find like we did before. Except this time, instead of finding something with a tag, we can just find the object named Game Manager. And then up next comes one of the most useful commands, one of the most useful functions in the entirety of Unity. And that is the get component command. So right now we have access to the Game Manager object, but we don't necessarily have access to the Score Manager script. So to get access to that, we can use .getComponent. And then it's got kind of a weird syntax, but we use the what are these called? Less than sign? It's gonna have a name, right?
Angle brackets.
Angle brackets, thank you. We use angle brackets, and then we can say Score Manager as the type of component, and then we need to add parentheses, empty parentheses after it, and that gets us access to the Score Manager component. You can use these for all kinds of components. You can use them for rigid bodies, for colliders. You just need to use get component, and that will give you access to that component attached to it. Yes.
Did we also need to add a semicolon?
Oh, I'm not done with this line yet, because the last thing we need to do is we need to add the die command, and then we can add the semicolon with the parentheses after the die command. So basically what we're doing is we're saying, okay, look through the game objects, find Game Manager. We got it. Look through its components, find the Score Manager. We got it. Call the die command on that. So we've basically narrowed our search until we found exactly what we want to change. So now, when you die, a text object should show up in the middle of your screen saying you died. Anybody get that? Anybody? Can anybody confirm that? Okay, sweet. Thank you.
So you need parentheses after die.
Yes, because it's a function or method or whatever
Had
you want to
a
call it.
spelling error or something.
You do?
It had an error. The code had an error and wouldn't run.
Was it because of the parentheses?
It's because I didn't have parentheses at first.
Does anybody need more time to look at this? The get component? Okay.
What is this, Dark Souls?
I should have put the Dark Souls thing in the middle. That would have been funny, actually. But
You need to like a
Yeah, there should be an issue actually with Obstacle Manager right now.
Yeah, it's not like.
It doesn't. It should be giving you something at the bottom. Yeah, and the reason for that is we're going to look at Obstacle Manager, and I'd like to explain a little bit of what it's doing before we actually have it create our obstacles. Because I've already got one set up that will create our obstacles for us randomly, but I'd still like to look at it and try and get an idea of some of what it's doing. Because it's it does some things. So first things first, our obstacle manager has a density, and the density just controls how many of these obstacles we're actually spawning randomly. So if our density is 100, it'll be spawning one every 100th of a second. If we have our density set to 2,000, it'll be every 2,000th of a second, so it'll be really fast. If we have it set to 1, it'll spawn one every second, which will be really easy to dodge. Then we have here our obstacle. So this is the game object that we want to spawn in. So by setting this game object in the inspector, we can set it as our obstacle, and then it will spawn that many, or it'll spawn that game object. And then we've also got a reference to player, like we did with our camera script. So the confusing part of this is this section down here and this line. So this is using something called coroutines, which I don't expect anybody to understand or deal with. We'll be talking about this in a much later workshop because it's pretty confusing. But basically, it's a function that you can pause and restart whenever you want. So it basically runs parallel to your normal stuff. So all this is doing is this is a very useful command, and it's called instantiate, and it's basically create a copy from a template. So here we're saying we want to make our game object copy, and we want to instantiate it based on our game object. And then here I'm setting the position to be 300 away in the Z, so far away in front of us, and then to be based on our player position, and then a random value. So the reason I'm doing that is because we can set it so that it spawns all the way spread out to the edge of the map, but there's no real point in doing that because our player can't even get all the way over there by the time they show up. So basically this is just spawning it so that our player wouldn't be able to just get around all of them, but it's spawned generally where our player is. And then all it does in the next line is it just waits 1 divided by the density until we spawn another one. So to get this working, all we need to do is we need to go to our game manager. The only thing that's currently disabled is the obstacle that's set. That's not set right now. So if you drag obstacle into this object, into this slot for the script, for the obstacle manager, it should start spawning them really just all over the place. So I would set the obstacle's speed to, I had it as 100. And then if you get rid of the obstacle we put in there earlier, it should start spawning them randomly in front of you. And you should start to be able to dodge, basically.
They're very far away.
Yes, you need to set the speed at much higher so that they actually move at a speed that you can...
Where do you put the script again?
Hmm?
How do you drag that thing in? Where do you put that again?
The obstacle manager? Which one? The obstacle manager is already attached to our game manager object. That came with the scene.
So where do you like drag it?
Oh, you're right. Okay, you're right. So the obstacle value here, this game object, I just dragged in our prefab for obstacle into there. I should have been slower doing that. That you can just drag this prefab into there, and basically it uses that prefab as its template for what object to spawn randomly. So as we were saying before about copies, as you can see here, there's still plenty behind us that haven't despawned yet. So it is a good thing we're despawning them, because that will get busy real quick. So who has a working version of our cube runner right now? Nice, nice, sweet. So go ahead and mess with the values, I would say, and try and make it harder or easier if you're interested. The values I have for difficult are 25 for density, and the obstacles moving at 200 speed. But that's what I have as a difficult version of the game. And it's pretty difficult. They move awfully quick. And there's a lot of them. Oh shit. I didn't see that one. Yeah.
Where do you change to the obstacle?
So that is in the obstacle prefab. With our obstacle script, we had our movement speed there. So you can set that to whatever you want.
The obstacles are working and everything, so I can just pass right through them.
So on your obstacle prefab, if anybody else is having this issue, make sure that your box collider is set to is trigger. That little box is checked.
Yeah, it is.
It is. So then it's not hitting at all.
Like that first box at the beginning, you can hit that one and die, but all the ones afterwards. Oh, go to your prefabs. They're down there.
Yeah.
Click on the prefab.
In your prefab, yeah.
This one? Yeah. Oh, that one.
Yeah, so the prefab is what controls all of them. You made an instance of it, so you made a copy and then changed the copy. So you want to change the parent one, basically. And that should set those correctly.
And we can just delete the original.
Yeah, you can just get rid of the original one. Just make sure the obstacle script is attached to the prefab as well. So, and then if you want to play this full screen, in case you guys haven't seen the full screen option, under the game tab, you can hit maximize on play. And all that will do is when you press play, it will fill the screen with your game, so you don't have to play it in this small window.
Where's maximize on play?
It's on the game tab at the top.
Game tab where?
And then in the top right of that. Ah.
So under stats.
It just says maximize on play.
Oh. Oh, I
Yeah,
see.
and then you like select it and it changes color basically.
Is there a way to get to restart without having to actually close out of it?
There is, but I didn't do that for this. So what you can do for restart is you can set it so that it either restarts when you die, or you can set it so that it's connected to a certain key, and then that will you can set it so that when it sets that key, it will reload the scene basically.
Okay.
The only problem with doing that with our current method is right now we are stopping time.
So you can't really do an input.
Yeah, input wouldn't be registered. So that you'd have to do something other than stopping time. So you could probably destroy the player object or disable the player object or something like that. But that would probably stop it, and then you could set it so that if you press that, you can do that. But right now, for what we're doing, I didn't want to get into too much, but that is what we should, yeah. So, is everybody's working right now that their cube runner's doing it? Sorry I didn't have you guys program in the spawning. I realized it'd be a pain to try and do it without coroutines, and I really didn't want to do that. So, and I figured that would be a little bit, I felt like a lot of people get lost trying to do that, so.
How did you do the spawns again?
The spawns were in Obstacle Manager, and I use a coroutine to run every X amount of seconds, basically.
And
You shouldn't have to change anything in it, necessarily. You just need to give it the right game object in the public. What's up?
coroutines are going to guide you randomizing, basically.
Not randomized. There's a random, you can just use random dot, and there's a lot of different ways to do random variables. What a coroutine is it basically just runs every X amount of seconds,
Okay.
and it's an easy way to set that up. So you could do a lot of different ways of doing it, but that's the way.
You want to have events with like a random probability of happening, the coroutine check for that like every certain amount of time.
Yes, if you want it to just go periodically.
Like rain or something.
Yeah, the random value is just random dot something, and you can use that every frame, you can use that whenever. But if you want to do something every certain amount of seconds, it's pretty easy to use a coroutine. But again, we won't get into those right now. I'm going to go ahead and actually program in a restart. I know we've only got 6 minutes, but is anybody interested in doing the restart for this so that we can do that? Okay, then we can do that. Feel free to leave if you don't want to. So probably the easiest way of that is I'm going to put it in Obstacle Manager, because I don't want to put it on our player if we're going to be disabling our player, because then we'd be disabling ourselves, and that might lead to some. Yeah, that definitely won't work. You don't want to do that. So I'm going to be putting it in our Obstacle Manager because it also has access to our player, so we can disable it easily. So I'm going to create a void update, and I'm going to put if I'm not going to put it in here. It probably would go better in Score Manager because I need to keep track of when I actually die. So I'm going to put I'm going to create a Boolean in Score Manager. This won't be nearly as structured because I'm kind of making this up as I go along, so bear with me. I'm going to put a Boolean in here called can restart. Or, yeah, I'll call it can restart. You can also call it is dead or something like that, like if you've died. And then in die, I'm just going to put can restart is equal to true. With the idea being we don't want them to accidentally press R and then restart while they're playing. We'd want them to do it while they're dead. So then we can use if input dot, I'm going to use get key down. So what get key down means is get key will, if you let's say you do get key of the R key, it will return true all the time you're holding R. So every frame you're holding R, it will return true. Get key down only does it for the frame you press R, while get key up is only the frame when you let go of it. So if you're only calling it once, you just may as well use get key down so you don't redo things too many times if you don't want to. So I'm going to use if input.getKeyDown, and then I'm going to use KeyCode.R. So that just is the variable for keys. Yes?
Do you know what the key code for spacebar would be? You just want to use the spacebar for restart.
That's the nice thing about KeyCode is if you do KeyCode, you can name it whatever you want. So there is a space for KeyCode. If you wanted to do like a character, like get key down, you can also write like R like that. But the problem with that is how do you write like alt? You know, like you wouldn't be able to write. That's not a character. You can't do that. So that's why KeyCode is nice for using that. So if you press R and you can restart. So if you have died and you press R, then we want to reload the scene. So to reload the scene, we actually need to add a using at the top. So there's actually a library that is not being used right now. And that is using UnityEngine.SceneManagement. Basically, that just lets you change scenes. You have to include that, or else you won't be able to. And then I'm going to put and you can use scene manager under our under our if statement. So if you've pressed R, now we want to go scene manager dot load scene. And then we could type the name of our scene, or an easier way of doing it is to just say scene manager dot loaded or scene loaded. And basically that just says I want to load a scene, but I want that scene to be the one that's currently loaded. So it just resets the scene is all it should do. All it should do. Maybe. No, it doesn't want to do that. Why don't you want to do that? Yeah, it's giving me errors. Can I get a name out of this? I might be able to get a name out of this. Give me toString. Will that work? I know there's an easy way to do this. No, it doesn't want to do that either. I'm writing the string. This is stupid. It's called sample scene. So loaded scene.
Scene management.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Scene. Another using statement? Alright, I'm just gonna put the string. I give up. I need to get the rest of this working. So then the other thing I want to do is game object dot not here, I bet. That's all we need there. So that should just reload our scene, if that makes sense. Next, in our die, I also want to put game object dot find object with tag, and I want to find our player. And I just want to set the player active to false. That way the player will basically disappear when we die. And after you've written that, after you set it active to false, you can head into player and you can disable, you can get rid of the time stopping part. Yes?
I was going to have you open that up again.
Yeah, no, I was just running over to there to show that you can get rid of that now. So even though we haven't actually set can restart to false, anywhere here it defaults to false, just like numbers default to 0. So we shouldn't have to set it anywhere that it's equal to 0. Yeah.
So when you restart game, will can restart remain true?
No, because it completely resets the scene, which means all of the starts run again, as well as all of these being set here by default are basically run like start is. So it's run at the start of the scene. Okay, sweet. Yeah.
Where's the part where you commented out like freezing the players?
Yes, so that is in the player script. And at the bottom under on trigger enter, that was where we set our time scale to 0. And I just commented that out, or you can delete it or whatever. Then someone will have to confirm, does this work? Does it restart?
It restarts, but when I died, I took out the time statement. The boxes just did not move in the by going up.
The score keeps going up? Oh, true. The boxes would keep moving. I didn't even think about that.
But the score is not reset to 0.
Yeah.
I kind of like that better.
It's just, I guess you can't move.
The score just keeps going up, and it doesn't reset when you restart. The score just keeps incrementing. So that's something that needs to be changed.
Yeah, you know what? We can do this. All right. We can fix the score part. I'm not going to touch the box part because that will be troublesome, but we can at least fix the score part right here in Score Manager by saying if our can restart is equal to true, or if just can restart. And then we can actually put our score updating part, this command here, this line, we can put that inside of the if can restart. That way, or if not can restart, that's what it is.
Use an exclamation point to make it false.
Yeah, that's what I
Negate.
Yeah. So, if we haven't died yet, keep updating our score. Otherwise, don't. Again, not structured right now. Just kind of making it up. So. Yeah.
Is there also a way to set the score back to 0?
When you reload the scene, it should set the score back to 0. If you press R, it should.
Because it's not.
It's not when you're resetting the scene?
I think you need to reset to 0 and die.
Yeah. And the longer I wait during the die scene, the longer it just increments suddenly when I restart.
Yeah. No, I know why that is. So the score is just actually showing the time. So the way I did the score is it just, when the time goes, it just goes up with the time. So does anybody know if there's a way to reset the timer? So like a time dot reset.
Maybe we need a variable to keep track of the last time the player restarted. So then you can subtract.
I mean, we could do that, but then at that point we may as well just not use time for score and just add a certain amount per thing. But, It's gotta be something. I'm actually curious if there's a way to reset the time in Unity. I'm gonna look it up. I'm gonna use my good friend Google. Oh, nice. Okay. So yeah, actually there is a pretty easy way to do it. And it is the way you said, actually. So here we can just use time.time. And we can actually use time.time minus time.time since level load. And so that will keep the time frame, the timestamp basically, when the level loaded. So at the start it should be 0. If we reload the level at 30 seconds, it should subtract 30 seconds from that. So.
Are you talking about like my suggestion?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's this. Yeah. So that should reset the score.
Okay.
So. I gotta see if mine will work.
My score's not incrementing. I broke it.
It's not incrementing at all? Did
It
you
increments every time I restart.
accidentally replace this statement with time since level load? Because it's time.time minus time.level load. It's
It seems to be.
it's the time minus this. You have that?
That's what I did. It's not.
You put exactly this?
Yeah. It seems like I did.
Mind if I see it? Or actually, does somebody else have a question?
Can you just put times this level load instead of subtracting it?
Oh.
Yeah, I'm an idiot. You're right. I just led a 2-hour workshop. You're killing me, man. Give me a break. Don't laugh at me. Don't laugh. But you're right. You totally can. And I probably just lost my presidency because of that. So.
It works.
Nice. So yeah, you guys have made a cube runner. Wasn't too bad, right? I'm gonna get a good score.
I like how the cubes just keep rushing past.
Yeah, as it just continues.
It's like the
$88 one time.
camera's momentum is he just kept going even though the guy died.
Honestly,
It's like you can't slow down for one summer.
Thanks for checking out this workshop, you guys. See you around.